In this section of the course, we will learn about CSS special effects. Now, special effects is not an official name. I just made it up. We could also call this section of the course non-essential CSS properties. In this particular lesson, we will learn about box shadow. So earlier in the course, we learned how to add shadows to text. In this lesson, we will learn how to add shadows to block level elements, like a div or an article. Here we are in the web browser viewing an example page, and let's imagine that we want to add shadows to these 4 blue boxes. So those elements are divs with a class of box A. So we can simply tack on new CSS properties within this rule. So to add a shadow to an element, we can use a property named box shadow. This property accepts 4 values. The first 2 values control the positioning of the shadow. So the very first value controls the horizontal positioning or the horizontal offset of the shadow. So I want it to sit 2 pixels from the real content. The second value controls the vertical positioning or the vertical offset. So if we include a larger value here, the shadow will sit further down from the real content. The third value controls the blur radius of the shadow. So if we want the shadow to appear blurred, we can include a larger value. Or if we want the shadow to be razor sharp, we can include 0 or 1 pixel. So let's include an average value like 5 pixels. And finally, the fourth value controls the color of the shadow. So let's begin with a black shadow. So if I save and refresh, we can see that the shadows have been applied. Now let's imagine that we actually wanted the shadow to not sit so far down from the original content and instead be pushed more to the side horizontally. So we can reduce the vertical offset value to 2 and we can increase the horizontal offset to 10. Now by default, these offset values push the shadow down and to the right. But if we wanted our shadow to be placed above or to the left of the original content, we can use negative values. So negative 10 pixels for the horizontal offset will position the shadow to the left. And if we use a negative value for the vertical offset, it'll be placed above the original content. However, I prefer my shadows to the bottom right of the content, so I will remove these negative values. Now let's adjust the color of the shadow. So currently we're using a hexadecimal color code, but we can also use an RGBA color to achieve transparency with our shadows. So for example, black in RGBA is 000, and the fourth value controls the transparency or the opacity. So if I set this to 0.5, you can see that the shadows are transparent. And if I lower this to 0.25, the shadows look a bit better. And I'm actually going to lower it to perhaps 15% or 0.15. Now I think they could afford to be even a bit more subtle, but because I want the shadows to clearly show up in this video recording, I will leave them at 15%. Let's change gears and talk a little bit more about the positioning of the shadows. So we learned that the horizontal and vertical offset can push the shadow to the right or to the bottom, or if we use negative values, to the top or to the left. But in all of those scenarios, the shadow was always on the outside of the original content, or an outer shadow. What if we want an inner shadow? We can include the word inset within our box shadow value, and if we save and refresh, we can see that that pushes the shadow to live within the content. In design, we typically call this an inner shadow. Now let's imagine we wanted to combine this inner shadow effect with the regular shadow that we had previously. Now your first instinct might be to copy this line of code, paste it, simply remove the word inset. But we can see that that does not work. So only the external or drop shadow is appearing, and that's because this declaration comes last in the style sheet, so it's simply overriding this declaration. So if we want to combine our 2 shadows, we need to combine them to live within one value, or within one declaration. Now we can do this with a comma. So after we've defined this shadow, we can include a comma, And then let's just copy and paste this exact same code. And then we can apply the word inset to one of them. So this is one shadow, comma, this is another shadow. So if we save and refresh, we can see that we now have both shadows. And we are free to adjust a particular shadow and it won't affect the other one. So they're independent of each other. So if we want to adjust the inner shadow to use a smaller horizontal and vertical offset and perhaps raise the transparency or the opacity a bit, we can do just that. And it doesn't have any effect on the external drop shadow. So feel free to use commas to layer on as many different shadows as you need to create your desired effect. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will learn how to add rounded corners to our boxes. I will see you in the next lesson.